One quick thing, let me reach in.
Okay.
Sure, what
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I'm Patty Limerick from the Senate of the American West, and I would like to say that I will be enjoying the floor here myself in a moment. So anyone else who'd like to join me on the floor, it's really important to retain flexibility in middle age here and to keep that kind of thing. So, and some of you who are not middle-aged might want to join me on the floor. So I will be there soon, and I guess there's a couple of seats down in the front at that point if you're having knee surgery or something like that. We would certainly respect that. So, okay, so I am grateful, as I always am at the Senate of the American West, for Kurt, Amanda, Ronnie, Honey, and Amber at the Center and their great work in pulling together an event like this. So, in fact, let's clap, for heaven's sake. Let's clap. We have some very fine upcoming events. Jim Enote, who is a very interesting Zuni farmer and writer and philosopher. He'll be here on September 17th for our Modern Indian Identity series, and on September 23rd we are co-sponsoring an event with the Boulder Sesquicentennial called Separated at Birth, Kindred Communities, and we'll have people from Portland, Oregon, Madison, Wisconsin, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Aspen, the mayor of Aspen, talking about similarities and difference between Boulder and those communities. So that will be really fun and unnerving. I hope it will be unnerving. If it's not unnerving, I won't be contented with that. So, okay. Oh boy, what an excellent group. Well, thank you all for coming. My goodness, thanks for you. And I think we'll be able, once we all settle into our seats, we probably are going to fit. Well, it's wonderful to have you here. So, okay, so the Senate of the American West, and probably your presence here is a sign of this, the Senate of the American West tries to have programs that are directly relevant to events and dilemmas in the West today, but we may have gone over the top in our plans for tonight. We did not coordinate with Los Angeles. We did not play any role in bringing on the troubles of that area, but that might be a factor, although, of course, this issue is always with us here in Boulder as well. Tonight, we have the nation's leading expert on the history of the human relationship with fire, and in fact, that statement was too modest and understated because, in truth, we have the world's leading expert on the subject of the human relationship to fire. Stephen Pyne is Regents Professor at Arizona State University, and here are some qualities that mark him as a scholar, a thinker, a writer, and a human being. He has the authority and wisdom that come from knowing the subject of his study firsthand. He was on a fire line right after he graduated from high school, and he worked for many years on a fire crew, so he is not studying this from an abstract distance. I'm going to say, younger people, we are having some older people coming in, and if younger people would like to join me on the floor, maybe you could yield a seat to some of the older people who are coming in if that comes up. Okay, so I'm sure that when Stephen Pyne was a kid on the fire line, he often he never had a seat to give up. In fact, he was okay. So anyway, so he's unusual as a scholar because he really has lived the subject that he's writing about. He has a personal loyalty and commitment to the people, from hotshots to scientists, to whom society has given the responsibility for dealing with fire. He has, as a temperamental quality, a very fine quality, a don't fence me in refusal of the usual boundaries and constraints of specialization. He is multidisciplinary in a very big way. He draws together an extraordinary spectrum of specialized knowledge from different fields. He studies the United States, Canada, Australia, Europe, Antarctica, and that is usually forbidden and wrong in many departments to cover that much territory, but he does it anyway. He has a warm and hearty and empathetic sense of humor. That is forbidden in some academic specializations as well, but he does that anyway. He has a gift for writing and speaking honestly about complex subjects without scaring off his audience. And he has extraordinary intellectual energy and productivity. His books are covered, oh my Lord, I won't go through the whole list. There's an enormous number of publications on the history of fire, including a memoir about being a firefighter himself. And then it turns out his most recent project right now is on the Voyager, of all things. He's really moving into the terrain. Well, he's taught on exploration and the encounter of humans with unexpected worlds. But Voyager, I did not see that coming. I thought I knew his patterns, but his patterns are beyond estimation and prediction. He is the author most recently of a book called Voice and Vision, A Guide to Writing History and Other Serious Nonfiction. And I must have seen some academic in serious trouble and lent my copy to him, so I don't have it to wave here. But Voice and Vision is a really important book for helping academics communicate with wider audiences. And here is my own, I shall now quote myself, here is my blurb from that book. Philanthropists seeking ways to add meaning and consequence to the academic pursuit known as research and scholarship could have a tremendous and measurable impact with one simple investment. Purchase hundreds of copies of Stephen Pyne's book and distribute them to social science and humanities faculty and graduate students across the nation. And the impact would be evident instantly. So, this is a man who reminds me a little bit, I'm going to go with the theory that envy is the most sincere form of flattery. And when I am reading other academic historians' work, envy is usually not a problem when it comes to sentence structure and so on. But when you read Stephen Pyne's work, you have moments where, well, for me, I'm reminded of a time when I was in graduate school. I had a ridiculous dream. I had not published anything myself at that time, but I had this dream where I thought that my students in the dream were coming up to me and saying, "Your book is on sale at the bookstore." I said, "That's so interesting. I haven't written a book." They said, "It's at the bookstore and it's got your name on it." And for reasons that are beyond understanding, I went with the students in the dream to the bookstore where we found a book called Garden Cities of Tomorrow, which had been written in real life by Ebenezer Howard, an urban planner of in Britain in 1900. But it had my name on it, and the student said, "Here's your book." I said, "I don't think I wrote that book." They said, "You have to autograph it." And then, thank heavens, I woke up, and I believe I woke up thinking, next time you have that dream, get a better book. So, when I am reading Stephen Pyne's work, I have moments where I think, oh, I wish I wrote that, which I don't have that many opportunities. And I would just like to read a tiny passage. You're just going to hear him, so it's a little bit goofy to do this, but here is. Okay, first you have to imagine your despair if you were told you had to write an essay, and in the very opening of the essay you had to use the phrase wildlands urban interface. And you want to write a lively essay, a peppy essay, but the rule is you have to start off with the wildlands urban interface. And this is how Stephen Pyne opens his article, Spark and Sprawl. Wildlands urban interface is a dumb term for a dumb problem. Oh, students in the room, wouldn't that be good if you had assigned readings that started off that way? That would make you happier, wouldn't it? And both the problem and the phrase have dominated the American fire scene for nearly 20 years. It's a dumb term because interface is a pretty klutzy metaphor, and because the phenomenon of competing borders it describes is more complex than that geeky term shows. Geeky term is a good phrase. I wish I'd written that. That's one of the moments there. At issue is a scrambling of landscape genres beyond the traditional variants of the American pastoral. It is a mingling of the quasi-urban and the quasi-wild into something that, depending on your taste, resembles either an ecological omelet or a coniferous strip mall. You see my envy issues coming into play. I would have liked to have written that. This means it also stirs together urban fire services with wildlands fire agencies, two cultures with no more in common than an opera house and a grove of old-growth ponderosa pine. Urban and wildland fires have little in common. One might as well link surfers and irrigation farmers because both rely on water. Okay. The wildlands urban interface is a dumb problem because technical solutions exist. We know how to keep houses from burning on the scale witnessed over the past 2 decades. We know convincingly that combustible roofing is lethal. We have known that for maybe 10,000 years. I didn't write that, but I was really happy to have the chance to read it, and I'm extremely happy to have Stephen Pyne here as our Study of the American West lecturer. So join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. Well,
Patty, could you get the lights over the screen turned off?
Oh,
So that
well, there's a concept for that.
sir,
Okay.
All right,
Okay,
well-
and
well,
can I
we're-
just say, any young people of flexibility that matches my own who'd like to join me on the floor here?
But we have a few empty chairs in
Yeah, and
front.
there are a few
Yeah.
empty chairs because I'm so flexible, I don't have chairs.
I mean,
Well, while we wrestle with the technology, let me begin by thanking you, and especially thanking the Center of the American West for the opportunity to come and speak on my favorite subject. I am a pyromantic, not a pyromaniac. There's an important distinction. And with that, let's think about where we can begin, because how the story ends, how the thesis comes out, in many ways depends on where you start. For American West historians, 1890 and the census is a traditional, if complicated, beginning. I want to begin in 1880. Believe it or not, the census for that year produced a map of forest fires. It also produced text to go with it. We have several other sources of text from essentially the same time. We have a pretty reasonable cross-section of what fire was around at that time. This is what it looks like. And if you read the text, you look at the maps and the rest, and you realize that the United States in 1880 was pretty much like Brazil today. The same kinds of mixes of fire, similar kind of agriculturally rooted burning, mixed in with rapid industrial changes, and in many ways a weak central government to control. But this is how it plays out. A lot of fire in the Northeast, not an area we would see today. A lot of fire around the Great Lakes. And this is the region that really alarmed people at the time we began thinking about formal fire protection. A lot of fire in the South. That's still where most of the fire is. If we factor in controlled burning, probably 80% or more is still located in the South. I have Florida highlighted here because the southern part of Florida, there was really no information, so there was nothing to indicate. But a lot of fire in southern Florida. The state forester of Florida a century ago declared in his annual report that 105% of the state had burned in the last year. Okay, the guy's mathematically challenged, but his thinking was that most of the land use at that time was open range grazing. They would go out in the spring and burn it off to get a flush of grass, and then a lot of times in the fall they would go back over the same area and burn it again to try to get a little second. And he reckoned if you added the whole area up, they burned off more land than the state had in it. This is a degree of burning that we have not known in the United States for some time. It is still visible in other parts of the world, and this is where we were at that time. You can see the plains aren't included because this is a forest fire map. California has lots of fires, but not where they are today. This is a map basically of mining. And similar, we can see other distributions. Basically, this is a map of human fire use embedded in agriculture and other kinds of disturbances. Well, that's then. 2005, the U.S. Geological Survey produced this map of large fires from 1980 to 2005. It's as though the geography has inverted. If you look at this, excepting some of the burning in the plains, this is basically a map of public lands. So a couple of things are going on, but the question I would like to address this evening is how did we get from here to there, and what does that mean for trying to cope with fire in the country today? Well, I'm a member of the fire community, as Patty graciously explained, and that means I have to think in terms of triangles. We can't explain anything without fire triangles. But I'm also a historian, which means that I think of things as historically constructed. So I'm going to propose a fire history triangle and see if I can organize these together. And this is going to have three components, three narratives. And I'm going to try, I'll look at separately, but then we need mentally to braid them together to see how the pattern actually plays out. What are these three narratives? One, this was the fire narrative. This is the fire on the planet. I'll be brief. But this is really what we share with everybody else. This is where our part of the fire story looks like everything else going on Earth. public land narrative, this is what we share with those countries that we consider our sort of cousins, our cognate fire powers. Places like Australia, Canada, Russia. Those other places that have similar investments in fire research, similar kinds of infrastructure for fire, and so forth. And the third is what we have uniquely. This is how we have put together our own values and choices, our own set of institutions and so forth, to put the fire, to create the fire that we want and try to prevent the fire we don't want. All right, the fire narrative. Fire's been around for 420 million years, since the early Devonian. Life created fire. The chemistry of fire is essentially a biochemistry. When it occurs in cells, we call it respiration. When it occurs out in the wide world, we call it fire. Life created the oxygen. Life created the fuels. The only thing life at the early days didn't control was ignition. But life will take control of that later as well. So I think this is something we don't often see in the fire literature. We have a lot of fire ecology, but fire is imagined as a physical or chemical disturbance, and the living system has to adjust to it. What if we were to think of fire as actually being, as I suggest it really is, a biologically constructed phenomenon? Then we would begin thinking about biological controls. We would begin a whole different set of imaginings about how to cope with it. All right. This is what fire looks like from natural ignition, just lightning. This map doesn't look like the others, does it? Anyway, the main center, I'm happy to say, is where I live, in Arizona, the epicenter. We've got the right mix of things, the right mixture of wet and dry conditions, wet and dry lightning. Florida, southern Florida, again, it's sort of extraterritorial in some ways, maybe extraterrestrial. It's off in its own world. And number of ignitions does not speak necessarily about the size of the fires that result. But this is a measure, sort of a rough measure of where the fires go. And this map has nothing to do, except in Florida, with lightning. It has to do with patterns of wetting and drying. The fundamental rhythms of fire require it has to be wet enough to grow things and then dry enough at some point to allow those things to burn with the right spark. And one last point, since we're dealing here with climate, you'll often hear the term fire regime. It's a very useful and important concept. The problem is that it gets complicated in unhelpful ways. And fire regime comes to mean fire cycle. It comes to mean as though fire is behaving like foresters. You know, it plants, it prunes, it harvests. And there is a cycle that goes on, and there is a certain pattern that follows. The fire regime is a statistical concept, and fires occur within a regime the same way that storms do within a climate. You can have a lot of different kinds of storms, but when you put them together, you get certain patterns so that Phoenix looks different than Cleveland. And we often hear in the ongoing discussions that there is a certain pattern. That pattern has to be replicated endlessly. That's not how fire regimes have historically worked. Well, I said that life will take control of ignition. One of my favorite paintings, actually from Australia. There it is. One creature wrestled control away from inanimate nature, gave it to life, and that's us. Probably Homo erectus could maintain fire. Certainly Homo sapiens could make it more or less at will. We have had fire as a part of our species heritage all of our existence. We are the only creature with that power, and I can't imagine us ever allowing any other species to acquire it. You want to talk about the unthinkable. Imagine our world unraveling if an insect, say, got the power, or marmots, or who knows what, could start fires. I mean, the place we'd burn to the ground in no time. But at this point, the other story here is that this becomes a biocentric argument in the sense that life is now taking control over the last part of the fire triangle and putting it in that realm. We have used fire all different kinds of ways. Since we're in this part of the world, there are some great paintings, 19th century. Russell, a crow burning the Blackfoot Range, using it hostilely. Here we are and Alfred Jacob Miller. Fires coming in, they're setting back fires and swatting it out since the wind is going to blow it into the encampment and try to protect themselves. The other way you do it is by setting a little escape fire. And then in the burned area, you will move everything into that burned area as the main fire bears down on you. And this was well known. It seems to have been forgotten, like a lot of traditional fire lore. So if you read Norman MacLean's Young Men in Fire, Wagner Dodge invents this escape fire. At best, he reinvented it because this was known for a long, long time and was very common in the West until it was ignored. This is another study we have roughly the same time as the 1880 map, John Wesley Powell's Arid Lands Report, one of the founding documents of conservation thinking in the West. Here's Powell's group, a little cropped, but this is Utah. And his crews have classified the land. So the white is desert, the green is irrigable land, potential farmland. The blue is the top of the plateaus. That's forest. So they're concerned about linking the forest and water with the green, but all of that sort of tan, intermediate stuff, burned area. So essentially from the edge of the deserts, as soon as there is thick enough fuel to carry fire up to the rims of the plateaus, this is regularly and routinely burned. Powell used this argument to illustrate how the West is arid. That means it goes through a dry period, which is why you have these fires. You don't have dry periods in the Northeast, so you don't see it. And he identified the source of the fires as what? The native peoples of the area. They are being moved around now, so there's some dislocation. This fact is known to everybody on the ground. It's just the people who aren't there who refuse to look at it, and concludes, and Powell was a great champion, particularly of the Paiutes, and headed the Bureau of American Ethnology at the Smithsonian for a while, concluded that if you remove the Indians, you remove the fires. And that's a large part of what happened throughout the West. Well before we began formal fire protection, this was underway. Controlling ignition is wonderful, but ignition is limited by the capacity of the landscape to carry fire. So if you want to increase your firepower, you have to get control over the combustibles. And this, for a fire historian, is the meaning of agriculture. We begin slashing, drying, draining, otherwise rearranging the landscape so that we can put more fire on it. And essentially outside of floodplains, agriculture expands as an exercise in applied fire ecology. And this is a great Finnish painting. The reason the girl is sad, by the way, is not that she's standing in this pile of ash. It's that this is a category of migrant workers, and all they do is go around and burn the land for other people. And they don't own the land themselves. So it's actually a social commentary, because it's so well understood that this burning goes on, that the guy can illustrate it in this way. Well, as Europe expands, it carries its fires with it, whether it's Russian monks carrying it into Eurasia or Wisconsin stump farms, all of which required fire to clear, but then also used fire to maintain. Fire was part of what made the land habitable. In the grasslands, you need to protect yourself from these wildfires because you're putting in a domesticated grassland and you don't want the fire, so you plow around it in anticipation. Here in Kansas in the 1870s, we've got a whole fire crew out here. So we've got a guy plowing a fire line, and they're burning out along the edge, and then they're coming along making sure sparks don't jump the line. So there it is, our sort of one-lick method out in the plains for you fire people. And my favorite technique, there are lots of examples of this. This is the beef drag. This is a Remington drawing. And what you would do is find some big steer out near the fire, kill it, split it open head to tail, tie it to the horses and drag it over the flame. And we're told this was worth 50 men. And so it's a little hard on your herds, but it's a big fire. But we're told it was very effective. And this is how you seek to control it. All right, but if you still want more power, you're going to have to look elsewhere. Because even if you start dicing up the landscape, there's only so much you can coax out of nature before the system begins degrading. So you are going to have to discover other landscapes and other sources of fuel to increase your firepower. And this is where it goes. We discover lands buried in the geologic past. We discover fossil landscapes. We began exhuming coal, oil, all the fossil fuels that we're familiar with, and we began this is the meaning for fire history of industrialization. And when we do this, one of the things that happens is that we quit doing all of the old kinds of burning. And that has ecological implications. The world today is pretty much divided into two grand combustion realms, and this is a great illustration of it. It's actually a detail from a National Geographic map, Earth at Night. And these are electric lights. The yellow are natural gas flares, and all the red is traditional burning. And among several points on this is that you don't see the two overlapping. You have one or the other. And when you industrialize, you begin taking that fire out of the landscape because you're routing it through other means. Give you a quick example. North Korea has been much in the news last couple of years. Here's an evening photo. Here's Japan, South Korea, China, Russia, and then we have this empty place, North Korea. If you look at a MODIS satellite from spring of active fires, that's where the active fires are. So you often hear the expression, fire is no respecter of borders. Nonsense. If there is a change in the landscape, a change in the social pattern, fire will obey that. Fire is whatever its setting makes it. And you can do this with other countries, by the way. It's kind of fun. The transition is something we have not really studied. I think of it as a Pyrrhic transition, similar to a demographic transition, because you have an explosion initially of fires. The population of fires goes out of control, often abusive, often damaging. These are samples from 19th, early 20th century. Again, we could think of Brazil or other parts of the world where we still see some of this going on. But then after you make the transition, you don't have replacement value for fires. Your total population of fire is plunged below, and you may actually suffer from an insufficient number of fires to do the ecological work that you want done. And my favorite of this is a coastal redwood converted to dairy farms in California. So again, this was the situation we were in. We went through this transition. We've come out on the other side. And one of the main reasons why fire has disappeared from the landscape is that we industrialize. And so we have all the effects of fire now. We can see it in this room, but we don't have fire itself. It's off-site. Okay, what about the second, the public lands? We began creating public lands. You have to manage them. It turns out that these places are going to have a lot of fire. And what are you going to do with it? There were a lot of experiments in the 19th century. Adirondacks Park in New York was an important one. The cavalry took over Yellowstone, 1886. They put out 60 fires that first summer. Why do we have a paramilitary approach to fire protection by the federal government? We inherited it from the cavalry. It's basically the reason. And we have not been able to advance beyond that. It was actually proposed, a National Academy of Science committee actually proposed that we teach forestry at West Point, that in effect we'd create a corps of engineers for forestry, and they would manage these forest reserves that were being set aside. There are lots of other experiments, Arkansas, Florida, all kinds of places. But basically, it would go to foresters, and this is part of a large global project. And one of the justifications for setting land aside was to protect it from fire, because they saw these communities are burning. The land is being scalped and destroyed. We have to stop this. The state will have to provide some mechanism to intervene and protect these areas from being overwhelmed by all of what we regard as sort of abusive burning. And this was a significant justification and exercise in sort of state control, rationalizing the landscape. The origins for it really come out of British India. Organized by a German botanist turned forester, Dietrich Brandis, one of the great figures in this larger project. And this is some of the numbers from British India as they began setting aside forest reserves. And here's the United States at essentially the same time doing the same thing. Gifford Pinchot wrote in his autobiography that he hoped to do in this country something of what Brandis had achieved in India. He regarded Brandis as a mentor. He studied briefly under him in Europe. And Pinchot's successor, Henry Graves, went through the whole British system. In fact, went on tour to British India on his way to the Philippines, America's new colony, and to try to bring fire protection there in the same way. So the irony here is that instead of protecting these areas from fire, we took these areas out of this industrial transition and they became a permanent habitat for fire. So why do we have extensive wildland fires today? Because we have extensive wildlands. And it's not simply a case that because you have this large land that big fires are going to happen. We have come to appreciate that fire is a part of what makes that system ecologically work. It has to belong in there. The question will be what kinds of fires we have. We come back to sort of the fire regime question. So the forester worldwide were obsessed with fire control. It's hard to convey the intensity with which they went at it. This was simply the beginning. This was the foundation. Until you had fire control, nothing else mattered. The first question asked at the first British conference on the forest reserves, 1870s. First question asked, is fire protection possible? And the second question, if possible, is it desirable? So there it is, the whole foundation. Everything else is going to be built on those questions. And from the beginning, there is a split. All the people in authority, the academics, the civil administrators, the colonial authorities, all insisted that fire protection had to occur or you could not manage the land, and it was a way of social control as well. All the people on the ground said this isn't going to work. And they predicted everything that has happened. The ecology is going to get screwed up, you're going to have more catastrophic fires. You create, in effect, a kind of insurgency of burning, which is exactly what happened over and over again. But here we have it in northern Rockies, here in India, our lookout fireman with a drum to alert the village to go out and fight it. And to show something of the power of these ideas, any of you fans of Kipling may have wondered what happened to Mowgli after he grew up. Well, Kipling wrote a sequel, and he tells what happens. Mowgli joins the Indian Forest Service and becomes a fire guard. And this is celebrated. This is one of the great achievements of bringing sort of modernism, modernity and rationality to this chaotic jungle landscape. All right. Moving along. It's too easy. I'm sorry, I get deflected on these. I'll try to keep going. How do we understand our own story? So we've created these public lands. We've changed the dynamic of fire. There are lots of ways to do it, and this is starting to look like historical astrology. No, I'm not going to do this. We're not going here. I just want to make the point that we don't have enough people working on these topics. And so we get one story and we simplify that, and then that gets simplified further, and that's how we tell it. There are a lot of ways to parse up this story, and a lot of different narratives can be constructed out of it, and that's all I want to say right now. I'm going to go through a basic, very simplified one that begins with the Forest Service engaged in its firefight. On average, they had one fire guard for every 670 square miles, much of it in country like this, and you wonder, what were these guys thinking of? How could they hope to contain this? One reason is that they saw the fire problem as essentially one of managing people. They could apply a kind of quasi-military control people, stop the abusive burning, stop this process of frontier conversion, which was generating all this mess. They didn't reckon with nature coming in, and they got a good sample in 1910. Big blow up, burned roughly 5 million acres of the national forest. Who knows how much? Probably 3.25 or so in the northern Rockies, most of that in a 2-day period, August 20 and 21st. Killed 78 firefighters in 6 different incidents in one afternoon, and led to the most famous fire story, Ed Pulaski holding his crew, his panicked crew, at gunpoint in this mine adit while the firestorm raged around. And yes, this is the same Pulaski who later invented the Pulaski tool, which along with the shovel is the basic firefighting implement. So this story gets retold every time you send somebody out on a fire line. This was a terrific trauma for the Forest Service. They spent $1 million over budget. If Congress had not upheld that, the agency would simply have been bankrupt, would have dissolved. The response to that, however, set up a pattern of emergency spending that we're still grappling with. It traumatized an entire generation. The next 4 chiefs of the Forest Service would all personally be on the fire line in 1910. This was sort of the long march of the Forest Service, and until that generation had left the scene, they would continue to refight the 1910 fire. Well, that same month, August, here we have Chief Forester Henry Graves. The first crisis, Pinchot had just been fired earlier in the year for insubordination, and is facing a fire crisis. This is the other side, something that was called light burning. And this was what people in the West generally wanted. They said the way to protect fires is to regularly burn off the landscape under light fires, under controlled conditions. This was supported by a whole mixture of peoples. None of them had sort of the academic authority or political clout of forestry, state-sponsored forestry. So they were beaten down, but the light burning controversy was a very serious one. All the questions we continue to debate today were all rehearsed. Why did the story turn out the way it did? Partly because the shock was too great. Having this agency traumatized, all these people die, you're now going to say that their lives were wasted, they were out fighting fires that we shouldn't have been fighting, that it was a misguided effort. You're going to dishonor them. The agency can't take it. It's a political issue now. There was even a fight with the Secretary of Interior at the time who supported light burning. So the whole thing is polarized. You are either with us or against us. You're either going to support light burning or you're going to support formal fire protection, and there is not going to be any possibility of a middle ground. And it took a while to fight it out, but the light burners were condemned. They were put in the same category, as perpetual motion mechanics and circle squares and other people who just don't understand how the world works and don't have proper training. One other event folds into this, which is really why the 1910 story is really our foundational story. Very convenient, very unusual for history to have something quite so compact. William James, our great philosopher of pragmatism, published his last essay called The Moral Equivalent of War. James was alarmed at what he saw was a growing militarism, particularly in Europe, and he argued that there ought to be some way to redirect that. Just as there was a mechanical equivalent of heat, there ought to be a moral equivalent of war. We'll redirect all that martial enthusiasm into our common enemy, the forces of nature. And he wanted a national conscription of youths to begin a fight against those forces. Well, there it is. James is dying in New England. The smoke from the 1910 fire is actually passing over at that time, turning the sun to a coppery color. And his essay is out, and there it is. It's all coming together, the whole package, and created a firefighting apparatus that we are still with. A lot of the heavy work has been done by the states. Something of the funding, I want to spend too much time, but the federal investment has been highly leveraged by cooperative programs with the states. Why has fire disappeared out of the states? Basically, the states did it. There was a great amount of enthusiasm and ingenuity, and in fact, almost reckless courage applied to fighting these fires. Here they are tracking them down in Arizona. Here in Arkansas, they had these special fire extinguishers and fire shields. They would form a phalanx with these wands and sort of move in on the fire. North Carolina following along behind the railroads, notorious for starting fires. California, well, they're going to put it on a car. They're not going to push something if they can drive. So they're at it. Alaska, this is the beginning of fire protection in Alaska. 1939, one guy would ride this thing from Anchorage to Fairbanks and back once a week. Pretty good job, I think. But anyway, that was fire protection. The idea of putting a movable blade on the front of a tractor instead of just using it like a mechanical mule, putting a movable blade on, giving us our modern bulldozer. Forest Service and Bureau of Road employee in California did that, and they wanted to build fire roads and fire lines. And then after World War I, we had a lot of surplus airplanes and Army pilots. Forest Service got together and they started an aerial reconnaissance program, which was a huge public relations coup for them. And there they are. You notice the Army pilot does not have a parachute and the Forest Service observer does. It's a safety requirement. There was no training. I guess the Army figured if the plane augured in, what was the point? But a federal employee was required to wear the parachute. The head of the Army program, by the way, was a guy named Hap Arnold, who later headed the Army Air Corps in World War II. So one of many ways in which we see all this kind of overlap. And the first radio work done in mountainous and forested terrain was done by Forest Service people looking to communicate with fires. And we set up a lab in Portland, Oregon. It was the main government electronics lab until World War II. My favorite photo from the archives was actually from Olympic National Forest. Top of this tree has been blown out, smoky. It's in punky wood up at the top. Well, they've got their orders, every smoke out. And so they felled this tree into it. And a guy climbed up it.
Oh.
And there's a bucket. So the guy taking the picture is filling the bucket up with water. He's hauling this bucket up and dumping it. A world before OSHA. They were proud of it. They took a photo of it. And in some ways, we have to honor that commitment. I mean, this is a set of convictions that this matters so much that you're willing to do something as absolutely idiotic as this to put out a smoke that 99.9% of the time isn't going to go further than that tree, particularly in that climate. But I can't think of any better testimony to how ferociously they went after it. Nonetheless, they're limited. They can only go so far. In the early 1930s, the drought years, the equivalent of the Dust Bowl were these huge fires that burned in the backcountry. And the Forest Service decided it had to do something about these. And there was also a kind of backcountry, if you will, temporal backcountry, what to do with all this abandoned land. It's been cut over and burned over, left. There's no economic value in this. First, a lot of it is now gone for tax delinquency. It's just left. These were sort of the subprime landscapes of their day. And what will happen is that the Roosevelt administration will see this as a primary arena for activity, particularly through the Civilian Conservation Corps. So we now have, the Forest Service has at long last its civilian army, the CCC. Most of what they will do is fire. Probably half or more of all their activities will be fire related. And they put in an infrastructure. This is my old fire cache, opening in 1936. Here's where our heliport is now. This was a 100-man CCC camp. The Army ran the camps. The agencies did the work. 40 years later, we just retook the photo. Same guy, same overweight ranger, same sultry seasonals. Nothing had changed. The CCC provided so much means that I think it finally changed, tilted the argument over how much fire protection we could really afford or was justified. In a sense, the means justified the ends. So by 1939, we have special crews, the origin of the hotshot crew, and smoke jumpers. But we also have projects like this. The Ponderosa Way is a 650-mile-long fuel break. It spans the entire western front of the Sierra Nevada. It was intended as a kind of Maginot line to separate the brush from the trees. Think about the sink of labor that was involved in this, and of course, once the CCC is gone, you can't maintain it, so you have to use something else. Anybody know what finally was applied to the remnants of this? It was Agent Orange, and then it was the experience using that on the old, what was left of the Ponderosa Way was then shipped over to Vietnam. In the midst of this, there is a big crisis. The Northern Rockies burns again. Chief Forester Gus Silcox convenes a group in Missoula to debate policy options. Silcox had been the #2 man in the 1910 fight. Incredibly, he wrote an article in November 1910 which said that the lesson of these big fires was that they were, quote, wholly preventable. If we'd had enough men, enough roads, enough trails, enough lookouts, enough telephone lines, we could have stopped those fires before they got big. And now I've got all the resources anybody could ever want. And so he is challenged in 1934 with another set of fires. They review it, and he concludes that there will be one universal standard for fire protection, controlled by 10 o'clock the morning following the report of the fire. Whether it's 100 yards away or 100 miles away, there is one standard. And if you fail, you plan for 10 a.m. the next morning. And you keep going. The 10 a.m. policy was an attempt to sort of break the fire menace once and for all. We will just pour all of these resources in and we will crush it. In effect, he's refighting the old fire. There's lots of enthusiasm. First Forester himself, interested in it, overseeing a new fire prevention campaign. Here's Uncle Sam, who looks a lot like this guy, who is in fact the artist, James Montgomery Flagg, who modeled it on himself. And then we get folded into a real war. We see this repeated remilitarization of fire protection. World War II does it again. Fire is identified as enemy fire. The military is brought in. The U.S. was subjected to incendiary attacks. These are these fire balloons that were launched from Japan at the end of the war, the first ICBM. The only civilian casualties on American soil in World War II came when some picnicking group stumbled on one of these in Oregon and was killed. But there was a massive program to try to shoot them out of the air, total failure. But nonetheless, the war ends with a whole series of incendiary weapons, of which the atomic bomb is the most formidable, and civil defense believes, as the military does, the next war will be a fire war. And so fire protection is now folded into a kind of national defense state. Our first national fire prevention campaigns emerged out of World War II, Wartime Advertising Council. There we are. That was pretty hardcore even for California. Fortunately, Disney released Bambi, so Bambi took the place for a year. Disney would only allow the rights to be lost for 1 year in the middle of World War II, and then they wouldn't allow it anymore. But there's no fire in Bambi in the original story. That was all put in for an American audience because you can't have an American forest story without a fire. And that's a very powerful message for children, particularly because the people who kill Bambi's mother are the same people who start the fire that threatened Bambi and his father. So the lesson was, go to kids, you have to invent a surrogate, and there he is, Smokey Bear. He was invented by a committee, by the way. And then 1950, a bear cub is found. Life imitates art. There's Hopalong Cassidy, seeing Smokey off to the National Zoo. A lot of surplus equipment left over by the Korean War. This is all rolled over into firefighting. We mechanized almost overnight. There was a staged photo outside Shasta. Another staged photo. We can see our air support and armored divisions moving in on the Red Menace fire. Maybe an iconography better suited for Guadalcanal than the backcountry of the National Forest. But there is a kind of Cold War on fire that is it is mobilized for that purpose and given that kind of justification. And science is brought into play for the same reasons by the same mechanisms, the same model. It's our Missoula Fire Lab. For those of you who know fire or fire science, that is Dick Rothermel, just hired as the lab opened. And we have our dumb name, dumb problem, Fire in the Fringe. Maine, 1947, the last in some ways of the old pattern. Southern California showing the new pattern. There, Bel Air, Brentwood, 61, perhaps the first of the celebrity fires. And this also marks the beginning of an iconic photo we see repeated over and over again whenever these fires occur, and that is of some doofus up on a wood shingle roof with a garden hose. And this goes back to 1961. Soon to be first doofus himself with a garden hose in a pose. I mean, we learn nothing and forget nothing. I don't know what to say about the Southern California scene. It's all been said endlessly. I don't know how you solve it. Well, this goes on until about 1970, and the Forest Service hegemony over fire is finally cracking. The Forest Service had control essentially over policy. It controlled almost all the fire research that was done. It controlled almost all the crews, the equipment. It was the vehicle for downloading programs to the states. It controlled it. But over the previous decade, that control began to crack. The big fires in 1970, Southern California and Alaska, that should sound familiar. Didn't we just go through that this year? Again, finally suggested they couldn't do this anymore. And they would have to rethink it. Now, some of the background, tall timbers, fire ecology conferences begin in '62. The Leopold Report for the National Park Service argues to reintroduce fire for that agency. The Wilderness Act creates a kind of legal and political leverage. Why are you sending bulldozers and B-17s into wilderness areas to put out a natural phenomenon? So there are a whole series of costs and challenges that are made. If you look at the burned area record up through this time, and we don't have the earlier ones officially, but they were even larger. Here are the federal lands in yellow, the state in orange, and the unprotected land. So you see, all the burning is occurring in the unprotected land. And as you move that into protection, it's very effective. Now, if this area is going to be managed for ecological values, you're creating a fire deficit that you're going to have to make up. But in terms of knocking down acres, this is very effective. But you've done all the easy work. Now the system's going to start biting back. These are three different scales just to show ignitions. Here's the burned area as a composite, and there are the costs. And this is not the emergency costs, the off-budget costs. So it takes more and more money, more men, more equipment, more science to keep the lid on. And the belief, the whole system crumbles. I mean, it's amazing how quickly it crumbled. So by '68, the Park Service has changed its policy. After a few stutter steps, by '78, '79, the Forest Service has done. This debate was settled a long time ago. The debate about whether fire belongs or whether suppression alone can work, we learned, no, it doesn't. We've been living with that for a long time. The question might be, as we approach the 50 years anniversary of this, why don't we have more to show for it? Or what has the revolution brought? There were 2 points, I'll be very quick here. It's a sort of a bi-coastal revolution. One was from Florida, looking at scenes like this, and if you don't burn them, you get that. The other from California, here's a redwood grove, 1890, 70 years later. Repeat photo, you can't see the trees for the forest that's grown up. So it's an ecological mess, it's a fire protection nightmare. The system is broken, it's out of control. This has been recognized for a long time now. Okay, but there were also differences. Florida's about working landscapes, California really about wild landscapes. Maybe we can come back to that later. I've got to get along here. So there are a lot of experiments that go on. You know, let 100 fires bloom. Fires deliberately set. Fires left to burn. All kinds of fires, all kinds of names, all kinds of experiments, trying to find some way to really make it work. The public was alerted to this essentially 20 years after it happened, when big fires at Yellowstone sort of put that issue before the public and began an era of celebrity fires. This book, Young Men in Fire, did something that nobody else had previously really succeeded in doing. That is re-engaging this whole fire story with the larger cultural story. Showing to people throughout why fire might matter, why it's an interesting topic, why it might be a part of our cultural history. And then 2 years after that, here in Colorado, the South Canyon fire, crew is burned over. It's almost the same thing. I mean, it was unsettling how close those two stories were. Why did the South Canyon fire make a difference when crews had been burned over repeatedly and nobody did anything about it? Because there was no cultural leverage to make that work. McLean provided that and really began changing the way we do it. That is embedded in what I would call this sort of cycle of celebrities beginning and ending in Southern California. Why do we keep coming back to Southern California here? But apart from California, which had a gubernatorial recall here, all of these other fire years, you'll notice, are election years. So fire season very conveniently comes just as you feed in the last photo op occasions to the election. If these fires had occurred 1 year out of sequence, I don't think we'd have a national fire plan. I don't think there would have been enough political traction to make it happen. So we'll see. All right, and then finally follow the money. 1908, you could spend off budget. 1910, the Forest Service does it for $1 million, which was real money back then. 1935, they say, well, we can use this emergency account in advance because we can now predict when the bad seasons are going to occur, and we'll start allocating this. It becomes a huge slush fund. So a lot of money out. That is brought under control. 1977, 78, as part of the policy reforms, the Forest Service got a much bigger regular budget with the idea that they wouldn't have to spend as much on emergency money, and that worked for a few years, and then the system careens out of control. We have a national fire plan with more money brought in here, and then Congress, which has other items on its plate, decides we're not going to keep financing this after the fact. And suddenly the whole system is threatening to burn to the roots. Chief Foresters, Henry Graves, 1910, said fire protection was 90% of forestry. Until you had it done, nothing else was the point. His successor, William Greeley, got it down to 75%. Greeley was the head of the Northern Rockies firefight in 1910. He begins his autobiography with the story of that fight. By 1960, we're down to 10 to 15% of the Forest Service budget for fire. We did it. We're up to 60, and depending on fire years and counting. And a couple of years ago, 5 former chiefs wrote an open letter to Congress saying, if we don't control this, fire is going to take 90% of the Forest Service budget. We've come full circle. And one reason I think fire has returned is because it never left. There was a profound sense among foresters globally that fire was something you passed through. It was like a childhood disease. It was like having measles or something. And once you got over it, you got on to be a mature country, and you didn't have to deal with all of these fire problems. Bernard Fernau, our first professional forester from Prussia, dismissed the American fire scene as one of bad habits and loose morals. And he said there was no reason for this, it will go away as the country matures. Well, it didn't go away because it turns out fire was at the core, and I could make the case, I think, it remains at the core and has always been at the core. And until we begin thinking of fire as integral, we're still in trouble. All right, so let's wrap this up. Where do we go? I don't see anything to interrupt industrialization. It's a more modern map of the two fires, and you see them even sharpening. You can see it on finer grain. You look at South Africa, you can see it working out. We may shut down some kind of fossil fuel combustion, but we won't be replacing it with open burning. We'll find other technologies to do it. What's going to happen to the public lands? This is the habitat for fire. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to manage it? One interesting story is that we have come through what we might call the life cycle of state-sponsored forestry. This was a major invention during the colonial era. It is now in an era of decolonization, is being scrapped. New Zealand disestablished its Forest Service. All the Australian states except Tasmania have disestablished their Forest Service. They've gone to do other purposes. The Canadian provinces are starting. The only two places that sort of keep it are the U.S. and Russia. And the U.S. is sort of, it reminds me of an old heritage building where the center's all been gutted and replaced with new wiring and furniture, but some of the old structure remains. This whole era has come around, and what is going to replace it? What mixture of institutions are we going to have? One of the interesting stories, I think, is the recovery of fire for the general populace. And the Nature Conservancies now burns more than the National Park Service. And efforts to put fire back into the hands of the, we treat it as though we're a government monopoly. We handled it as though we're atomic energy or something. You can't trust people to burn, their leaves. We can't trust ranchers to burn off their lands. That seems to be in process of changing. And then our whole process of national experience. We've got lots of fire problems. Maybe in question period we can talk a bit about it. We still don't know really how to handle in wilderness. The intermix, my alternative term for that word I won't use. How to put fire back in various means. What are we going to do with global change, for heaven's sakes? How is fire going to play in? What is this whole mega fire thing? But let me focus on the one that seems to have people's greatest attention, which is the return of fire to the urban fringe. It's sort of back to the future. So here's Spokane, 1994, I believe. And here's Peshtigo, 1871. We had a whole wave of fires, disastrous fires during the old 19th century frontier. That ended. Now we've started it all over again. So that was an era of agricultural settlement. Fires would originate on the outside of the forest reserves or parks, burn into them, and the landscape was being chewed up, put into a form to burn. Now we have an urban encroachment. Now the fires are burning from the reserves out. We've gone through this sort of looking glass, and we're still creating landscapes designed to burn. A satellite photo from Rondônia in southwestern Amazonia, typical settlement pattern, and Breckenridge, Colorado. I understand from conversations the Beatles have had some say in this, and they may be taking steps, but my point is that we're talking about large-scale colonization. I would think a recolonization of what had been a rural landscape by essentially urbanites. And the patterns of settlement, here we have too much of the wrong kind of fire, here we probably don't have enough of the right kind. And California and the wildland urban interface. Here are the numbers, burned houses back to 1990, but the relevant figure is here, 85% in California. California is to this kind of fire what Florida is to hurricanes. So yes, it is a national problem, but if you do the numbers, unless you want to use a logarithmic scale, it won't show up, except for California. And we might be thinking about what's coming up. I'm going to skip this and conclude with, since I'm more and more an academic now, how we think about it, and suggest this photo to discuss for a minute. This is a Biosphere 2, north of Tucson. Santa Catalina Mountains, Tucson on the other side. 2 fires, or 2 visions of fire in the world. Here we have a sort of full-throated wildfire. 2 years that 85% of the mountain burned. And in some ways, a celebration, in some ways. So here it is, wild nature doing its thing. If you go into Biosphere 2, there is no place for fire. Not even a candle. This is a closed, completely engineered, in some ways sustainable world. A kind of ideal, almost a utopian view. There are all kinds of signs as you walk through. It says, in case of fire, break glass. They are not talking about breaking glass to pull an alarm. They are talking about breaking glass of this dome so you don't suffocate. And there are axes to break the glass. They figure you have 8 minutes of oxygen. In reality, probably 4. So this is a vision of a world, a completely contained, sustainable world in which the sooner we get rid of fire, the better. But do people really have these kinds of conflicting views? This is a book called Fire and Civilization. It was published by a Dutch sociologist. This is the European edition. And we see fire in a built landscape. Well, that's Europe, okay? In this case, there's masonry, but it could be an agricultural constructed landscape. Here's the American edition. So we have a nice view of fire, but I don't see much civilization. And these are essentially the 2 visions of fire we can see in that background, and they are competing visions. If I were to pick a few representative views of how the American public might see fire, we can go to these 2 extremes again. One, fire in a built environment, fire used malevolently, fire about people, or the famous ilk bath from the 2000 fire season, a fire, a pristine landscape, a benevolent sense of fire. We might add this sort of intervening landscape, but I'd point out that both of these views are urban visions. And they both lack one thing that strikes me as a historian, and that is neither one of them has really a place for us as constructive agents. And the stories we tell today about fire are not stories about us doing what we have done all of our existence as a species, that is to manage fire, to use fire to make our world habitable, and in effect to be a steward for the rest of the living world. And so I would think you were asking, what can the humanities contribute? I think we can contribute a number of things. I hope this sense of history gives you some way in which the problems we have today have arisen. But we need to tell another way to tell a story that has us in it. Because right now, the middle is gone. So it's a great era for lightning fire in wilderness. It's a great era for feral fire in places where we inhabit. It's not a great era for that middle ground where we manage the land actively with fire. And that's what's missing. So with that, let me close and thank you.